This is an overview of the rebalancing techniques that we use that are considered a little bit unusual in terms of other dog training techniques and working with animals. So one of the exercises we do, and this started with horses, is that we have an exercise we call the flight or the journey of the homing pigeon, which just means that there's a person on either side of the animal. So that's how I would define the umbrella of the homing pigeon, is at any time there's a person on either side of it. And there's a little exception in this exercise I'm going to show you, but the beeline is one, and that means it's just a single rope that goes between. So beeline is one, butterfly is another, 2 points of contact, one on each side, and that could be a leash on either side or the 2 points of contact with the leash handle or the connector and a sliding rope, for instance, on the other side. So that's all going under the umbrella of homing pigeon. So just in terms of the terminology. So the beeline, we used the beeline. It was something, I think it was in 2007. It was sort of an accident that we started using it at a training where there was a puppy that was really difficult on a leash, and two of our practitioners decided that they would just put a piece of clothesline through the top ring on the harness and kind of follow the puppy a little bit. And I thought at first it was sort of a silly exercise, and then I saw the difference in what happened with this puppy. Suddenly the puppy was willing to go on the leash quietly with the people, and there was no problem with that. And the next day the staff reported that instead of grabbing at the hands and the leash when they went to attach it to the collar, the dog trotted along with them. So I thought, well, that's interesting. Maybe it just works with puppies, and that's where it started. But we also found exceptionally helpful with older dogs. Maybe they've never been leash trained. And this is the case often with greyhounds, that they're meant to be taught to go on a leash, but sometimes they haven't been, and they're quite reluctant to go on lead. Some rescue dogs, especially in areas where dogs pretty much run free and they haven't had a lot of handling. And dogs with little social exposure. So this can also help with separation concerns, because as you'll see in some of the videos and so on, is that the dog has the complete freedom to move to whatever side they want to be on, even if it means going on the other side of their person. It can be helpful for shy and fearful dogs. And again, the dogs have a lot of choice with this, and it can help in introducing new people. So it's not the focus that it's about like going for a walk, having an attachment that isn't fixed, and it can make a very big difference to many dogs. So I consider that the beeline used to be originally called the clothesline or the washing line, depending on what country you were in, is the space between being on a lead and off a lead. And we know lots of dogs that are far better when they're off lead because they have, of course, much more choice. And there are some dogs that may be better on leash. I haven't met too many, but that could happen. It's great for dogs who are reluctant on the lead. It's you just give them a little bit of time and they don't feel like they're being pulled. Dogs can't lean to one side, and that helps them find their own balance. And I don't know if you've ever walked a dog who was kind of leaning and it almost felt like their legs would trip you because they were leaning away from you. They can't do that in the beeline. Yes, there can be a forward pull, but there can't be that sideways imbalance. It gives freedom to the dog to make the choice, whether they come near to someone or they go far away from someone. It's totally their choice. We don't try to encourage them or urge them to come near the person they're a little bit nervous of. It's wonderful technique for coaching a client because you're on that other side, so you can give them the skills, especially if they've never had the ability to be able to walk their dog on a loose leash. Now, when we first started it, of course, we're always trying to make things better, and we just simply ran the ring through the back ring on a harness, and you can still do that. But what we found is if we add a swivel clip, it makes such a difference to the success, because it means that if the dog turns around within the configuration, there's no tangling. That certainly had happened in the past. However, the clip does need to be appropriate for the size of the dog. I don't want to be using a really big clip with a little dog and vice versa, because of course a clip could break if the dog was a really hard puller. So there's different sizes we use. So what the beeline kind of looks like is it's a single rope that runs through a ring on the back of the harness, and using the swivel is ideal. Ideally and generally, we tie knots at the end of each of the ropes to keep it from sliding through that harness or the swivel ring should one person have to let go. So it's a safety factor that you can use. Now, here's some pictures of using the beeline, and you can see that ideally that the rope is in two hands. It allows you to make the turns more easily, and it allows you to, if you want to or you need to, stroke on the line to get more forward, you can do that, which you could not do if it was in one hand. This also helps people stay more balanced. Now here's in the upper right is one of being in the labyrinth, and you can see that the person on the outside of the turn or the person on the right side of the picture is sighting up so that she's going to be able to start to make a little bit of a turn as we go around a corner. You can see that it allows this dog in the lower right really the ability to sniff and get their nose down, and that's something that is very beneficial for every dog really. So here's a little bit of beeline practice between two people. Now I know in this current situations, most people would not have people to practice with, but you can see that this is quite a good exercise when you do have that ability, and it's something that we tend to do in all the workshops we do. So the butterfly. So the beeline, I would say, is I usually use it on dogs, especially if they have a tendency to lag or not come forward on the lead. It's not as effective generally on dogs who are super pulley. However, I still like to use it so that it gives them that different context or that new experience. And if you remember from some of the earlier on lessons, one of the reasons we do things in such a novel way is that's how we can start to change habits. We cannot change a habit by doing something in the same way over and over again. So this is where some of these exercises come into play, and it doesn't mean you're going to continue to do them all the time, but giving those different choices and new experiences will help change in the situation of the old experience. So occasionally, even if I know it's not going to work, I'll put them in the beeline to give them that experience. Now the butterfly, the rope then comes around, the same rope comes around from the back ring and then back through the ring on the chest. And that way, what happens is you can use it with two hands on the lead, or you can use a handle. I tend to still use more often with two hands. And it gives more influence to the handler. So it's helpful for dogs who are really forward, because what you can do is stroke and step forward. So stroke and stride on the front rope as you're bringing the dog back into balance. So it acts a little bit like a balance leash, but with two people. It is also helpful for dogs who are very, very, have had a lot of obedience training, and they will do pretty much anything if you tell them what to do, but they're a little bit lost if they aren't given that clear direction. So it's useful because it gives them a little bit more influence or a little bit more information about what we want, so that they don't feel like they have to make all those choices for themselves. So here are some pictures of the butterfly, and you can see that this is just the one on the lower left is, I just wanted you to see how it goes through that front ring, and any harness that has a front ring, you can do this exercise with. And you can see in the top right, we have the lead in the rope in two hands. And what we would do for the stopping, what I do is I have the line in two hands, and I then pick up the front lead and I stroke it between the two hands as I'm stepping forward. And that way it helps to bring the dog again, shift the weight back off the front end so that they can come and stop in balance rather than on a lean. So the half butterfly, this is the one that isn't really homing pigeon, came from an exercise I was doing with a dog who was quite forward going, a German Shepherd, lovely dog. And the butterfly worked brilliantly, but then she said, what do I do if I'm by myself? And so I said, well, what happens if we simply just take the one end of the rope, so that we're bringing, the rope is going to be simply coming around the chest and the shoulder on one side and you're holding the rope on the other side. So it's really allows you again to give the dog more space, so that, but you've only got one person. So it allows the handler to let the rope slide through your hands if you have a very forward going dog. And I have a very interesting video from Germany that I will put up with this that shows you how we can let the line slide through the hands. Now, I might use gloves or a cotton rope, and maybe both, with a very strong dog, so that I can let that line slide through. As soon as we can let it slide, then we interrupt that opposition reflex. And that's really important for these big dogs that kind of bound forward, because they can easily pull you off your feet. And then you can stroke to get forward by walking up beside the dog and bringing him around you in a curve. So here is how we've taken the half butterfly. So the rope is still going around I'm on the dog's right side, and the rope, you can see, is coming along or on the left side through that front ring and then up to my hand. Now, one of the advantages of this as well is that the harness doesn't slide. So that makes it quite useful for very forward going dogs. Now, the connector, the T-Touch connector, has kind of been it's very similar to the half butterfly, and sometimes easier for people to really, say, use a very long line on the dog to give your dog a lot of space. So this is what we're going to do. This is just an overview of the exercises, and then I've broken them down individually. So what you can see is there'll be one for beeline with a lot of video, and a butterfly, and so on, so that you get a better idea of how to actually do it. And I think that you'll find that even when some of these exercises seem rather chaotic, they still work. And I think that that is the most unusual thing that we actually do, and the most surprising thing. And that makes it actually quite interesting to do.